There is a number that most men carry around in their heads, a silent benchmark they've never questioned, never verified, and never traced back to any real source. It shapes how they feel about themselves. It affects their confidence in relationships. And for millions of men, it becomes a quiet but persistent source of anxiety that they'd never admit to anyone. That number is how long they think sex is supposed to last. And here's the uncomfortable truth. That number is almost certainly wrong. Not slightly off, not a rough estimate that's close enough. Completely, fundamentally wrong. And the gap between what men believe is normal and what the science actually shows is so wide, so striking, that understanding it has the genuine potential to change how you feel about your own body, your relationships, and your sense of self. That's not an exaggeration. Stay with this. Before we get into the data, and there is real, rigorous, time-stamped data on this, it's worth asking where that internal benchmark even came from, because most men have never had an honest, accurate conversation about sexual performance. What they've absorbed instead is a cultural collage of pornography, exaggerated locker room stories, and the kind of confidence performance mythology that gets passed around without anyone ever actually checking whether it's true. Pornography in particular has been studied extensively as a driver of unrealistic sexual expectations. Research published in journals on sexual behavior has consistently found that regular consumption of pornographic content distorts men's understanding of normal duration, normal body responses, and normal female arousal. The performances men see on screen are not representations of typical human sexuality. They are edited, artificially extended, and produced with the specific goal of stimulating fantasy, not reflecting reality. Yet for many men, that's the primary reference point they have. And when real life doesn't match a fantasy produced for entertainment, the result is a sense of inadequacy that has no basis in actual biology or actual human experience. Now add to that the social layer. Men talk about sex in ways that are almost never honest. Exaggeration is the norm. Vulnerability about insecurity is rare. What gets passed around in conversation tends to be the version that sounds impressive, not the version that's true. The result is that most men are comparing themselves against a standard that was inflated by other men who are also comparing themselves against an inflated standard. It's a feedback loop of fiction. And the emotional cost of that loop, the quiet anxiety, the performance pressure, the way it can creep into a relationship and erode intimacy, is genuinely significant. So let's replace all of that with something real. In one of the most rigorously designed studies on this topic, researchers recruited 500 heterosexual couples from 5 different countries: the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, Spain, Turkey, and the United States. These weren't survey responses. These weren't self-reported estimates. Each couple was given a stopwatch and asked to time penetrative intercourse from initial penetration to ejaculation over a period of 4 weeks. 30 separate sexual encounters were logged per couple. The methodology was deliberately designed to eliminate the inflated self-reporting that had skewed earlier research. The results were precise, repeatable, and for most men genuinely surprising. The global average duration of penetrative intercourse, what the research defines as intravaginal ejaculatory latency time, was 5.4 minutes, not 15 minutes, not 20, not the half-hour benchmark that circulates in casual conversation, 5 minutes and 24 seconds. That was the median. The full range stretched from under a minute on the lower end to around 44 minutes at the extreme upper end. But the center of the distribution, where most couples actually clustered, hovered between 3 and 7 minutes. There was also meaningful variation by country. Turkish couples in the study averaged around 3.7 minutes. UK couples averaged closer to 10 minutes. But in every country studied, the average was dramatically lower than what men typically believe it should be. Let that sit for a moment. Because if you've been carrying the belief that normal, satisfying sex should last 15, 20, or 30 minutes of penetration, the data is telling you that virtually no one is doing that. The average couple anywhere in the world experiences roughly 5 to 6 minutes of penetrative intercourse. That is not a failure, that is not a dysfunction, that is the biological norm. Now here's where the conversation needs to go deeper, because understanding the number alone isn't enough. You also need to understand why men are so disconnected from what's actually normal, and what the neuroscience and physiology behind this actually look like. The male sexual response cycle, in terms of penetration to ejaculation, is governed primarily by the sympathetic nervous system and the reflex arcs of the spinal cord. It is, at its biological core, a relatively rapid process. The neurological signals involved in ejaculation are ancient, deeply hardwired, and not particularly inclined toward the extended timelines that modern culture has invented as an ideal. This isn't a flaw in male biology, it's simply how the system is built. The pressure men feel to override that system, to consciously suppress a physiological reflex for extended periods, isn't a sign of sexual skill. It's a misunderstanding of what skill actually means in this context. What women find satisfying in sexual experience is a question that deserves its own honest examination, because it's frequently misunderstood in a way that compounds the problem. A widely cited survey of women found that the desired duration of the overall sexual experience, foreplay, penetration, intimacy, connection, was around 25 minutes. That number sometimes gets extracted and compared to the 5.7-minute average for penetration alone, and men read that gap as evidence that they're falling short. But that framing is almost entirely wrong. The 25-minute figure refers to the full experience, not penetration in isolation. And when researchers have asked women specifically about what contributes most to their sexual satisfaction, duration of penetrative intercourse consistently ranks lower than you might expect. What ranks higher, consistently across cultures, across age groups, across relationship types, is foreplay, emotional connection, attentiveness, and the sense of being desired and prioritized by their partner. The female arousal cycle is physiologically different from the male arousal cycle in ways that are directly relevant here. Research on female sexual response has consistently shown that arousal in women typically builds more gradually, requires more varied stimulation, and is significantly influenced by psychological and emotional context. The clitoris, which contains more than 8,000 nerve endings and extends internally throughout the pelvic region in ways that weren't fully mapped until relatively recently, is the primary anatomical site of sexual pleasure for most women. Penetration alone, without adequate arousal and attention, is often insufficient for orgasm or deep satisfaction. This is not a secret, it's physiology. But it's physiology that gets drowned out by the cultural myth that longer penetration is the primary variable that separates satisfying sex from unsatisfying sex. It isn't. The quality, attentiveness, and emotional resonance of the full encounter matter far more. What this means practically is that a man who spends 15 or 20 minutes on genuine foreplay, building arousal, paying attention to what his partner responds to, creating a sense of intimacy and connection, and then experiences 5 or 6 minutes of penetration will, in most cases, create a far more satisfying experience for his partner than a man who rushes through minimal foreplay and then attempts to extend penetration indefinitely through conscious suppression of his natural response. The arithmetic here doesn't favor the latter, and yet the cultural story we tell is almost entirely about the latter. That's a collective misdirection with real consequences. There is also a psychological layer to this that's worth naming directly. The anxiety that surrounds sexual performance, the fear of finishing too quickly, the self-monitoring during sex, the anticipatory dread that can build before intimacy even begins, can itself become a self-fulfilling dynamic. There's a well-documented phenomenon in sexual health research called spectatoring, a term coined by the pioneering researchers Masters and Johnson. Spectatoring refers to the psychological state of mentally stepping outside your own experience during sex and observing yourself from a critical distance, evaluating your performance, monitoring your responses, measuring yourself against some imagined standard. And spectatoring, ironically, tends to worsen the very outcomes it's anxious about. It disrupts arousal, erodes presence, and creates a feedback loop of anxiety and self-consciousness that makes genuine intimacy harder to access. The research on spectatoring as a driver of sexual dysfunction is substantial. Addressing it through mindfulness-based approaches, cognitive behavioral strategies, and honest communication with a partner has been shown to improve both sexual satisfaction and perceived control, often without any change in the physiological duration of intercourse at all. This connects to something that sex researchers and therapists have observed consistently, that men who are most satisfied with their sex lives are not typically the men who last the longest. They are the men who are most present, most communicative, and most genuinely attentive to their partner's experience. Presence is the variable that matters. Connection is the variable that matters. The capacity to stay curious about what your partner wants and to respond to that in real time. Those are the skills that create genuinely satisfying sexual experiences. Duration is a secondary factor that has been inflated to a primary one by cultural mythology. Now, there are cases where duration genuinely is something worth addressing. Premature ejaculation, defined clinically as ejaculation that consistently occurs within approximately 1 minute of penetration and causes personal distress, is a real condition that affects a meaningful percentage of men at some point in their lives. Estimates vary, but research suggests somewhere between 20 and 30% of men experience it at some stage. It's not rare, it's not shameful, and it is genuinely treatable. The most evidence-supported behavioral interventions include the stop-start technique, developed by urologist James Siemens, and the squeeze technique, which involve training the nervous system to tolerate higher levels of arousal without triggering ejaculation reflexively. Pelvic floor training has also shown meaningful results in clinical studies. A 2014 study found that targeted pelvic floor exercises helped men with lifelong premature ejaculation increase their average latency time significantly over a 12-week program. For men where behavioral approaches aren't sufficient, there are pharmacological options, including certain medications that were originally developed for other purposes, but were found to delay ejaculation as a secondary effect. The point is that if premature ejaculation is causing real distress for you or your partner, there are validated, evidence-based approaches. You don't have to accept it, but you also don't need to catastrophize it, because it is far more common and far more addressable than the silence around it suggests. On the other end of the spectrum, there is a condition called delayed ejaculation, the persistent difficulty or inability to ejaculate despite adequate stimulation. This is less commonly discussed but affects a meaningful number of men, and its prevalence appears to be increasing. One contributing factor that sex researchers have been paying closer attention to is the impact of high-frequency pornography use combined with a specific masturbation pattern that requires intense, specific stimulation to reach climax. When that pattern becomes the primary sexual template, real-world sexual experiences, which involve a different quality and type of stimulation, can feel comparatively understimulating, making ejaculation difficult. This isn't a moral judgment about pornography use. It's a neurological observation about habituation and desensitization. The brain adapts to the stimulation it receives most frequently. If that stimulation is highly specific and artificially intense, it can make the brain less responsive to more naturalistic experience. Recognizing this pattern and making adjustments, which might include periods of abstinence from pornography or changes in masturbation practice has helped many men recalibrate their responses. Again, it's worth addressing if it's affecting your relationships or your well-being, and it's more common than men typically realize. There's also a conversation worth having about communication, specifically the degree to which most couples never actually discuss what they want sexually with any directness or honesty. Research on relationship satisfaction consistently finds that sexual communication is one of the strongest predictors of both sexual satisfaction and overall relationship quality. Partners who can talk openly about preferences, desires, what feels good and what doesn't, tend to report dramatically higher satisfaction than those who rely on guesswork and inference. And yet, this is one of the areas where most couples invest the least. The discomfort around explicit sexual conversation, even with a long-term partner, is widespread and understandable, but it creates a situation where both people are navigating based on incomplete information, hoping the other person is satisfied, and rarely asking the kinds of questions that would actually clarify what they want. The awkwardness of a direct conversation almost always costs less than the accumulated frustration of years of guessing wrong. What does this all add up to? It adds up to a fairly significant collective misunderstanding about what sexual performance actually means, what normal sexual experience actually looks like, and where the real opportunities for improvement actually exist. The number, 5.4 to 5.7 minutes of average penetrative duration, isn't just a data point. It's a recalibration. It's a permission to stop measuring yourself against a fictional standard and start understanding what genuinely matters in intimate connection. The gap between what men think sex should look like and what it actually looks like, between what they assume women want and what the research says they value, between performance and presence, that gap is where so much unnecessary anxiety lives. When men release the pressure of an impossible standard, something interesting tends to happen. They become more present, they become more curious, they become more attentive, and paradoxically, all of that tends to result in more satisfying experiences for both partners, not because the duration changes, but because the quality of attention and connection does. That's not a coincidence. It's exactly what the research on sexual satisfaction would predict. So here's the reframe worth carrying with you. Your body is not broken. The timeline you're working with is not a failure. The average couple in a scientific study timed with a stopwatch finished in under 6 minutes, and those couples included people in satisfying, long-term, fulfilling relationships. Duration of penetration is one variable in a complex, multi-dimensional experience. It is not the most important one. It may not even be in the top 5. What matters is the quality of arousal you help build, the attention you bring to your partner's experience, the emotional safety you create, the communication you're willing to have, and the presence you're able to maintain when you're actually in the moment together. That's what the data points toward. That's what the research on satisfaction consistently confirms. And that honestly is a far more reachable and far more meaningful standard than anything you absorbed from pornography or a locker room. The real conversation about sexual health isn't about adding minutes, it's about adding depth. And that conversation starts with knowing what's actually true.